Jimila. Diduda.
Hello, Nampala Gablola Denge meetings on the Chuse Kamanga Nesta in the Star to Perot Nang Caliguli.
Lokyitsang lakwa dimi yuna.
Kyablo breakfast singing to breakfast kini minde mayuna dire wala sanitir.
정말로 어느 감찍이 나고 저기 마페로치. 아니 동마들 안다 다 로키상 모두 돌듯이나 다 로키상 다 망치 로통을 해서거들아 이내 단다 부므런 바체 and so lobjo the cultural anthropology University of Colorado Boulder and 단다 단대 둘 아니 단다 postdoc 슈라 어디 Leiden University 나고래 슈에이 and the 냠도 아니 단다 하가 editor the co-founder 체 아니 다링기 단다 슈게기 단다 먼저 돌링란에 주시디 so the 인진나로 체 so this will be a session in English so Dawa will be speaking in English for this morning session so but feel free to ask the questions in Tibetan later on once her presentation is over Dawa
I think you guys are going to get a little break and I'm going to be speaking primarily in English. Just to quickly kind of highlight what kind of work I do, I'm known to do scholarship. I tend to focus on empire and colonial studies, indigeneity and sovereignty, specifically through the frameworks of Tibetan agency, in reaction to and against China's developing settler colonialism in Tibet. I am probably the only Tibetan doing this kind of specialized work. Because of that, a lot of Uyghur, Taiwan, and larger Asian studies is heavily informed by my work because of the way I talk about China in new ways. So I'm much more interested in creating new kind of scholarships and new kinds of arguments. If you guys can show a link to get an idea. So that's decolonial. This is the University of Melbourne. They've collected decolonial thinkers around the world. I'm considered one of the only Tibetan ones. If you go down, these are some of my primary sources. These are some of my work, upcoming work that's about to be published soon. Some of them are already published. All this to say you can find my work online. And if you go to the next, Placard Diaries, me and my friends started this in 2011. One of our co-founders is Surin Yangzom Lama. She wrote the book, We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, which has become internationally acclaimed. We did this primarily because we didn't like the way that white people and Chinese scholars were writing about Tibetans. So we created this platform to be a rebuttal for the kind of knowledges that we want to see on Tibet. Kazi machine kitchen on chungsa that shunge dunzu tagya pejutang ni shukyawatus. All this to say, our Hakka Diaries platform gets read and is part of syllabi around the world, specifically in Tibetan studies, religious studies, and decolonial and empire studies. So you can easily go on Hakka Diaries. Does anyone know what Hakka Diaries is or heard of it? Can you show hands? So a few people know. Okay. Next. So currently, the reason why I'm showing you this is because I'm about to become a postdoc at Leiden University in Netherlands, where I will be working. So some of the stuff I'm gonna be presenting you, this is new stuff, it's not published. It's gonna be coming up in my upcoming book project. It's called Resurgent Tibetan Otherwise Worlds, Radical Compassion and Relational Education in Times of Globalizing Settler Colonialism. You can also find this online. And there's a little description of the kind of project I'll be doing with this book. Essentially, I'm reimagining Tibetan experience in exile, not just as survival and endurance, but an actual resilient movement against China. All right, so I'm gonna begin the presentation. Next. 1 second. All right. How do we heal in a world afflicted by constant crisis? Chamdang Yingje insists His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso. Without love and compassion, life itself cannot be sustained. This is what I remember thinking when I visited my late friend Gyatso at Yongling in April 2022. Yongling Preschool and Kindergarten is a well-known early education center in Dharamsala, founded in 1984 by a group of Tibetan parents. As the schools grew, the founder invited Dawa, Gyatso's father, to take full responsibility for its finances and day-to-day operations. Under his leadership, Yongling has steadily developed into a trusted day school that Tibetan families in Meklotganj continue to rely on. Before becoming the director of Yongling, Dawala was a student at CSD Dalhousie, a school established in 1963 by His Holiness. His journey reflects both his roots as a beneficiary of Tibetan education in exile and his enduring role in shaping the lives of Tibetan children today. I first became familiar with Yongling when my parents enrolled me there in 1988. For me, the school was not only a place of learning, but also a gathering space where our family celebrated Losars together. I have fond childhood memories of learning and playing with Dawala and his family on the school grounds. Even after moving to the United States as a child, these memories have helped keep our families close. That's why, whenever I return to Dharamsala, I make it a point to visit Yongling to greet and pay my respects to Dawala and his family and catch up with their children. When I visited in April 2022, Dawala's youngest son, Gyatso, was home. We greeted each other warmly. It had been 3 years since we last met. Now, in his late 20s, Gyatso carried himself with a maturity that hadn't been so noticeable before. As usual, he was surrounded by friends. He introduced me to Tenzi, whom I hadn't met before. Gyatso explained that they had been schoolmates at Apatisivi. Tenzin belonged to a generation of Tibetan children who arrived in India during the 1990s in search of education. Many were sent by their parents, often smuggled across the border, while the parents remained behind in Tibet. Most of these children were enrolled in and later graduated from residential schools run by the Tibetan Children's Village or the Tibetan Homes Foundation. At the time of our meeting, Denzi came across as aloof and a bit confused. He's not doing well mentally and emotionally, Gyatso confided when the two of us were alone. I noticed that many people in Dharamsala seemed a bit weathered. I attributed it to the pandemic lockdowns, which had triggered widespread mental health crisis around the world, and Dharamsala was no exception. The impact, however, had been especially hard on Denzi. Without any family in India, he had to endure the lockdowns alone. Many young Tibetans in Dharamsala, like Denzi, who had come from Tibet as children, suffered disproportionately during the pandemic, lacking the familial support others could rely on. The situation was further strained by new security measures imposed by Chinese authorities in Tibet, which made wiring money to relatives in India a punishable offense, with threats of arrest. My friends are not able to access the money they usually depend on from family, Gyatso told me. It's making their situation even more difficult. According to Gyatso, these combined pressures took a serious toll on Denzin's mental health, pushing him into a downward spiral. His friends became concerned when he stopped eating, prompting Gyatso to bring him home for a while. At the time of my visit, Tenzin was staying in one of the spare guest rooms at Yongling, alongside others whom Gyatso had persuaded his father to take in. This way, I can keep an eye on him and make sure he eats, said Gyatso. I was deeply moved by Gyatso's concern for his friends. Although he couldn't change the difficult circumstances that had contributed to Tenzi's mental health and emotional decline, he responded with compassion and care, exercising the agency he did have to support his friends. Tenzin's crisis was, in many ways, inseparable from the broader reality of the Chinese occupation of Tibet, which had severed him from the comforts and support of his family. Gyatso understood all this too well. Born and raised in a community of recent arrivals from Tibet, many of whom had been separated from their families, he had long navigated these complex social, political, and emotional terrains. It was perhaps this awareness, shaped by years of friendship and firsthand experience of such suffering, that made Gyatso's response all the more meaningful. In Tenzi's time of need, he showed up with quiet compassion and care. I begin this introduction with the following story because this presentation centers on and insists upon the practice of love and compassion. When China invaded Tibet and consolidated control through military force in 1959, Tibetans faced a catastrophic upheaval that ended their entire way of life. Overnight, they went from being sovereign subjects of their own country to becoming a colonized minority within China and a displaced refugee community in exile. Since then, Tibetans have lived in a state of ongoing precarity and crisis, a reality that has caused profound suffering, such as Tenzin's. This presentation explores how Tibetans survived a national catastrophe and forged a new beginning in India by building Tibetan schools and investing in children's education and care through a radical practice of love and compassion. I emphasize that it was this practice that enabled 3 generations to create a meaningful and ethical world, not only for themselves, but also for others escaping from Tibet into exile. I illustrate this through an intergenerational account of love and compassion as practiced by former students and staff of the Tibetan school system in exile. These individuals shared their stories with me in oral history interviews conducted between 2015 and 2022. After I explained my interest in tracing the development of Tibetan schools in India, the Tibetan diaspora around the world, and their international struggle for freedom from Chinese oppression through their personal historical accounts. Slide. Taring Amala guided and supported my development in the absence of parents, reflected Ngawan Dorji. We met at his home in the Belakupi Tibetan settlement during the winter of 2020 to talk about his educational and professional journey. Founded in 1961, the Belakupi settlement in South India had taken Tibetan refugees 2 difficult years to build. Over time, Belakupi became home to all the major monasteries of Tibet that Tibetan refugees rebuilt in response to China's destruction of these sacred places during Cultural Revolution. In Ngawan Dorji's account, Taring Amala remained a steady presence from the moment he arrived as an orphan at the Tibetan Homes Foundation in Mussoorie, crediting her as the driving force behind many of the positive developments he experienced in his life. At the time of our meeting, he was supposedly in retirement, having completed his term as the first principal of the Dalai Lama Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies in Bangalore, India. The college, which opened in 2013, was developed under Jetsun Pema's leadership and marked TCV's first venture into higher education. I say supposedly because Ngawan Dorji and his wife, Yishitoga, were both working as teachers at the nearby Dashilumbo Monastery. They had been coaxed out of their retirement after a visit from Zegyab Rinpoche, the abbot of Dashilumbo. At the suggestion of His Holiness, many Tibetan monasteries in exile had begun introducing academic subjects such as math, science, and English alongside their traditional monastic curriculum. Since Ngawan Dorji had previously served as the education director of the TCV school system, Zegyab Rinpoche sought his help in developing this new educational program for monks between the ages of 6 and 14. When I visited, Ngawan Dorji and Yishitoga were both actively teaching young monks and assisting the monastery in creating a curriculum that would qualify their students for accreditation in India. Ngawan Dorji told me about his life and the guidance he had received from Taring Amala, even as he was actively shaping the educational development of a new generation of monastic students. It was hard not to notice the parallels. In many ways, he was now playing the same role and offering the same kind of care and guidance that Taring Amala had once provided him. This not only highlights the far-reaching impact of her investment in and care for the children she looked after, it more importantly underscores the depth of her relationship with them and how that bond helped shape who Ngawan Dorji is today. What follows is an intergenerational account of his and others' stories. Everything we did as students was in the name of Tibet, said my father, Dashi Tundup, while reflecting on his experience at CSD Mussoorie, which was under Taring Pala, Jigme Taring. Taring Pala and Amala told us that even the act of keeping one's nose clean of snot got us closer to a future return together in a free Tibet. This understanding of the future as collective, something shaped by the shared actions of the present, was emphasized by His Holiness from the very beginning of exile. He recognized that rebuilding the biological, cultural, and political worlds of Tibetans in exile required mutual care. This is why he established care-based institutions such as schools and entrusted leaders like Dorma Tsering, Rinchen Dorma Tagla, Khandro Chansuesang, and Jetsun Pema with the task of providing children with both care and education. In the absence of a nation and amid the profound loss of family, caring for each other became a radical act, one that not only sustained life, but also helped to produce and maintain the Tibetan nation in exile. Care then was not just an emotional or practical necessity, it was a political strategy for collective survival. This interdependent understanding of survival, that it depends on and is bound up with the survival of others, is embedded in how we Tibetans conceptualize Dendel, the Buddhist principle of interdependence. Dendel emphasizes that all things arise in dependence on others, that nothing exists on their own. It challenges the notion of the self as independent, insisting instead that we are co-produced through our relationships with each other. Understanding care through this lens as inherently interdependent and relational was central to how Tibetan refugees enacted the broader project of community survival in exile. It shaped how school authorities understood and provided care, making even the most mundane acts, such as personal hygiene, expressions of collective responsibility and belonging. This perspective is echoed in Taring Amala's autobiography, where she writes, click, "When we get our country, Tibet can never be the same as before. The next generation will be more knowledgeable, and by preserving our religion and culture at the present time, we can make sure that in the future, the truth of Buddhism will be practiced by all Tibetans." Her use of we, our, and all underscores her belief in a shared future and the collective nature of the work she was doing. Her efforts, especially in nurturing and guiding individual students, were fundamentally about building this communal future. In the following, I explore how this interdependent framework of care and collective purpose informed the care Ngawan Doji remembers receiving from Taring Amala. Next. In 1963, Ngawan Doji was sent by school authorities in Dharamsala to the Tibetan Homes Foundation. He remembers Taring Amala as a busy woman, deeply engaged in the day-to-day work of running what was then simply homes, which would later evolve into a full-fledged school under her leadership as its director. Despite her responsibilities, she always found time to dote on the children. Ngawan Doji and my father's generation recall how informal and frequent her acts of care were. In the everyday spaces of home, it was common to see her cleaning a small child's nose or wiping dirt from their face, straightening a school uniform, or affectionately smoothing down a child's hair. Others recall how she would sometimes invite a group of the younger children to her home, where they were treated to home-cooked meals and spoiled with treats by Taring Pala and Amala. While she couldn't provide such personal affection to every child, children still took comfort in witnessing her care for others. Even if they weren't the direct recipient, the visibility of her affection reassured them. According to Ngawan Doji, this made her amazing and mesmerizing in the eyes of her students. Being seen, cared for, or simply witnessing such gestures made children feel looked after and valued. It was through these affective forms of care that she earned the title Amala, a mother not just in name, but through her dedicated service and love. Beyond offering affection, Taring Amala, who also invested personally in the lives of children through sustained guidance. This was true for Ngawan Dorji. In 4th grade, she began taking a personal interest in his academic progress. One day, instead of going on a Sunday picnic with his home parents and peers, he stayed back at home number 3. There, he had a chance encounter with an American woman visiting Homes Foundation. He offered to give her a tour of the campus, and she was so impressed that she asked Taring Amala if she could become his financial sponsor. The woman, the wife of a US consulate official in Delhi, wanted to support Tibetan children. Shortly afterwards, Taring Amala called Ngawan Dorji into her office to share the good news. He remembers how pleased she was with him for making a good impression and recalls her saying, "This is how we will get back our Rangzen." From that moment on, Ngawan Dorji believes he came under her watchful eye. With financial support from the American woman, Taring Amala decided to send him to an English medium convent school. At the time, Holmes Foundation served as a residential home for children while they attended schools at CSD Missouri. As enrollments grew, some students were sent to private convent schools funded through the Tibetan government scholarship and foreign aid. Many of these students came from homes or the nursery in Dharamsala, as neither had yet developed formal schools of their own. These private English medium convent schools, originally established during British rule, were attended by children from India's upper classes after independence. Ngawan Dorji was first sent to Bremley Towers and a year later transferred to St. Joseph's Academy for Boys in Dehradun. He eventually completed his high school education at St. George's in Missouri. Since he was an orphan, he returned to home number 3 during school holidays. On one of the visits, Taring Amala noticed his improved English and called him into her office. She instructed him to start teaching beginner-level English to kindergarten children. From that point on, he spent every holiday break teaching at the Holmes Foundation. Taring Amala would occasionally sit in on his lessons, observing his progress. According to Ngawan Dorji, this experience instilled in him a deep sense of responsibility and helped him mature. In return, she gave him pocket money as a token of appreciation and encouragement. These early teachings experiences sparked his long-term interest in becoming a teacher. After Ngawan Dorji completed high school, his American sponsor was no longer able to support him. She had divorced her husband and returned to the United States. Despite this setback, Taring Amala encouraged him to apply to college and assured him she would sponsor his education herself. Because of this unwavering support, he says he never felt like an orphan. He always knew he could count on her. Ngawan Dorji's story highlights Taring Amala's constant presence, guidance, and care throughout his educational journey. It also shows how she shaped his character and future path. By assigning him teaching responsibilities early on, she nurtured in him a sense of accountability to others and inspired his career in education. Her sustained guidance and emotional investments were critical for his academic and personal success. Through these deeply relational forms of care, she became a maternal figure to many students, and Amala in the fullest sense. These are the stories her students continue to recall, not just to honor her, but to illustrate how meaningful relationships formed in exile schools helped shape responsible individuals devoted to the well-being of their communities. Next. While Ngawan Dorji's story highlights the significance of Taring Amala's care, how did she herself define what care meant? Click. Towards the end of her autobiography, Daughter of Tibet, Taring Amala offers her take on how she saw her responsibilities overseeing the making of homes and caring after children. She writes, click, I drew inspiration from this opportunity to serve my country and delighted in the taking care of the orphans, educating them as my own children. These destitute children became a substitute for my own, and for almost 20 years, I dedicated my life to them. This quote illustrates how Taring Amala viewed care as both a personal and a political act. For her, caring for the refugee children was not only an expression of maternal compassion, but also a way to serve the Tibetan nation. Her sense of ethical responsibility was deeply shaped by a nationalist commitment to preserving Tibet in exile, which included preserving the lives of children. Taring Amala's nationalistic ethics were also shaped by her personal grief. After fleeing to India, she reunited with her husband Jigme Taring and her eldest daughter Tseang. However, she remained separated from her two younger children, Ngutu Wangmo and Yangdro, who were still in Tibet. For years, she had no knowledge of their fate. Despite this profound uncertainty, she continued to lead Holmes Foundation and care for other children until she finally received news in 1979 that they were alive in Lhasa. Taring Amala's perseverance reveals how care in exile become a radical political act, an affirmation of Tibetan survival in the face of Chinese occupation, loss, and displacement. But her care was also not only nationalistic, it was also profoundly Buddhist. Before she accepted her role with the Holmes Foundation, Taring Amala considered taking up a religious lifestyle. She told her husband that she wished to devote herself to spiritual practice in search of the truth. He encouraged her to think further and reminded her of their teacher, Jetun Lonsha Rinpoche, a revered Nenjoma or a yogini, who once said that anyone can lead a religious life anywhere by watching their own mind. This teaching helped Taring Amala see that she could fulfill her spiritual aspirations by caring for others, especially the most vulnerable. Her decision to lead Holmes Foundation thus emerged not only from national obligation, but also from a Buddhist commitment to alleviating the suffering of others. This fusion of national service and Buddhist ethics was not unique to her. Many Tibetans of her generation, including her husband Jigme Taring, who worked closely with His Holiness, saw their efforts in exile as both political and spiritual duties. These combined ethics of care also shaped how the first generation of Tibetan refugee children, including Ngaon Dorji, experienced care. It was not just emotional, it was instructional. Care meant being prepared to lead Tibet in the future. As adults, many of these children went on to embody and reproduce the same ethics of service in their own roles within the exile community as adults. Next. The 1970s were a defining period, recalls Ngaon Dorji. In contrast to the destitution of the 1960s, the 1970s offered new hope. As the first generation of Tibetan students began graduating and moving into the settlements built by their elder generation, Ngaon Dorji describes this as a synergetic time marked by a shared sense of purpose. Everyone wanted to serve their country and community. For many young graduates, political advocacy against China and service to the Tibetan exile community became core to their identity as Tibetans. Many of today's veteran writers, activists, and civil servants, such as Hwasang Tsering and Jamyang Nobu, were politically active youth during this era. After high school, both joined the Chushigondro Army base in Mustang, Nepal to train as soldiers to fight against the Chinese army. Around the same time, in 1970, the Tibetan Youth Congress was founded, now a prominent political and welfare organization with regional chapters across the diaspora. TYC emerged from the activism of this generation. Many of its founding members went on to become high-profile Tibetan politicians and diplomats. Among them, Lodi Gyari played a key role in building diplomatic ties with the United States, securing vital aid and advocacy for Tibet in the US Senate and Congress. While some individuals focused on founding political advocacy organizations, others joined the Tibetan exile government as civil servants, working to support their community. My father, Dashitundup, was among them. After earning his degree from Punjab University, he became a dedicated civil servant in Dharamsala. His first posting was as the settlement officer of Tenzingong refugee community near the Arunachal Pradesh border, where he met my mother, Yeshu Wangmo. Later, during the 1980s and 1990s, he simultaneously served as the security officer for His Holiness and as the settlement officer of the Dharamsala Tibetan community. In many ways, the first generation of students fulfilled the vision of Taring Amala. As adults, they returned to their communities and became the human resources essential for leading the next phase of Tibetan exile development. It felt as though we were in a movement together, recalls Ngan Dorji, describing the era's collective energy and momentum. His own journey illustrates how this wave of graduates turned professionals helped drive positive progress for the broader Tibetan refugee community and their cause in exile. In 1972, the same year Ngawan Dorji graduated from high school, the nursery in Dharamsala was officially registered in India as the Tibetan Children's Village under the leadership of Jetsu Pema. She had assumed the role of director following the death of her elder sister, Siringdoma Tagla, in 1964. As the nursery transitioned into a full-fledged residential school, it began recruiting administrative staff, home parents, teachers, cooks, nurses, and other essential personnel. During this era, both homes and TCV evolved into independent residential schools themselves, operating autonomously under the Tibetan government in exile's education department. In 1975, TCV opened a new branch in Leh, Ladakh to serve Tibetan nomad families who had resettled there as refugees. It was the first of several new branches established in Tibetan settlements across India. The goal was to reduce pressure on the overburdened CST schools and to bring schools closer to where families lived, minimizing the distance between children and their parents. As a result of this expansion, job opportunities in education and administration became plentiful, according to Ngawan Dorji. Part of what made the era feel hopeful was the abundance of employment opportunities for recent graduates of the Tibetan school system. Ngawan Dorji decided to apply for a teaching position at the newly established TCV in Dharamsala. With a letter of recommendation from Taring Amala and help from his friend Sewang Yishi, whose brothers worked on TCV administrative staff, he was introduced to Jetsun Pemala. In the winter of 1972, Ngawan Dorji joined TCV as an English teacher, alongside a cohort of young Tibetan educators who, like him, had graduated from English medium convent schools. Former students often refer to this period at TCV as the Golden Age. At the time, TCV offered no extracurricular activities. So Ngawan Dorji took the initiative to create sports and drama clubs for the students. You can see him in the pictures. In addition to teaching English, he became the school's drama and physical education teacher, organizing competitions that quickly became popular among the students. His efforts made him a beloved figure among both students and staff, and he was invited to stay on as permanent member of the school. Although the offer appealed to him, he was encouraged by Mr. Khan, TCV's first Indian principal, to pursue further education. After 6 months at TCV, Ngawan Dorji left to begin college in 1973. As Ngawan Dorji left to pursue college, Pasang Siring joined TCV in 1974 as an English teacher, following a year at the Chushigondro base camp in Mustang, Nepal. That same year, the base was forcibly shut down by Nepali government after the CIA withdrew its funding. At the time, TCV was still transitioning into a full residential school and required extensive development. In 1976, at just 26 years old, Pasang Siring became the school's principal. He hired many former Chushigondro veterans as laborers and alongside male students aged 17 and older, they constructed what are now TCV's main playground and classroom. Many of those veterans remained at TCV as cooks until their retirement. Both Nga Dorji and Lasang Siring recall how demanding but rewarding this period of building and improvement was. These improvements did not go unnoticed by their students. Those who attended TCV during this time recall the new cohort of young teachers and staff as bringing a wave of exciting new changes. Yeshidoga, who entered the 7th grade during this era, remembers the impact of these new educators. Many had graduated from private English medium convent schools, and their strong command of English significantly raised the standard of English instruction at TCV. They were the best English teachers I had, recalls Ngawan Dorji, recalls Yeshidoga, now a retired English teacher at Upper TCV. She also remembers how this new group introduced social activities they themselves had enjoyed as students, drama clubs, sport events, and more. For example, Nga Dorji's extracurricular clubs were modeled on those he had participated in during his own convent school years. The energy and innovation these young teachers brought sparked enthusiasm among students and made learning more engaging. Before this new generation of Tibetan teachers arrived, subjects like math, science, and English at TCV were primarily taught by Indian and foreign teachers. Their arrival marked a major shift. For the first time, Tibetan teachers began taking charge of core academic subjects. This stood in contrast to CST schools, which were staffed mostly by Indian teachers due to their funding and management under the Indian government. With a growing team of capable Tibetan educators and administrators, the quality of instruction, particularly in English, improved dramatically. TCV students began excelling in the All India standardized exams required for high school graduation. As a result, the school's reputation soared, and admissions became competitive, with parents vying for a place for their children. By the end of the decade, the first generation of students had fulfilled the elder generation's vision by becoming the educators and caretakers of the next generation. Their deep dedication to transforming TCV into a thriving institution turned the school into a household name across the Tibetan world, even inside Tibet. By committing themselves to uplifting their fellow Tibetans, they took a crucial step, one that Taring Amala and her peers believed essential in advancing the national cause of Tibet in exile. Next. I met Tapsang in January 2020. He was teaching Tibetan language and literature at the Dalai Lama Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies in India, where Ngawan Dorji had served previously as its principal. You can see him in the blue, in the green picture with His Holiness on the side. Tapsang was part of the second generation of Tibetan students who arrived in exile from Tibet following the end of Cultural Revolution, following Mao's death in 1976. In the period that followed, travel restrictions between Tibet and India were briefly lifted, allowing many to reunite with family in exile and see His Holiness the Dalai Lama. My father, Dashitundup, was working at the welfare office as Dharamsala's settlement officer during this time. He recalls how Tibetans from Tibet began arriving in India at the beginning of the 1980s. At first, they arrived in small numbers, but soon this steadily increased, with an average of over 5,000 to 6,000 Tibetans arriving yearly. This triggered another era of building in exile, as the community began to construct new schools and training centers to cater to the growing number of children and adults arriving from Tibet. As the settlement officer, my father was responsible for arranging to meet the varied needs of the newly arrived refugees, from reuniting them with their families to helping them enroll their children in schools, monasteries, or vocational training. Newly arrived Tibetans brought with them stories of the widespread death and destruction that had taken place in Tibet during the Cultural Revolution, which both devastated and emboldened Tibetans in exile. Tibetan exiles in India also returned to Tibet, but their stories more often told of hope and renewal. They brought news of the Dalai Lama's government, of monasteries that had been demolished in Tibet being reconstructed in India, and of the success of Tibetan schools. In this way, word of a national Tibetan community in exile made its way back to Tibet. These stories, according to Tapsang, made life in exile seem exciting and hopeful. Moreover, many of Tapsang's classmates at the Chinese public schools he attended in Lhasa had already escaped. The combination of these stories and his classmates' departure aroused Tapsang's own curiosity. Aware of the free education and accommodation the Dalai Lama and his government was offering to Tibetans escaping from Tibet, Tapsang decided to make the journey to exile. In 1995, when he was 13 years old, he escaped from Lhasa into Nepal and then made his way to India. In leaving Tibet, Tapsang also left his family. In this, he was not alone. As a member of the second generation of students in exile, his story was shared by many. Tapsang told me that it was neither family pressure nor a lack of opportunity that motivated him, since he came from a modest background. Instead, he felt enticed by the hopeful prospects of the national project that exiled Tibetans were building under the Dalai Lama's leadership. In recounting his successful escape to Nepal, Tapsang describes the Tibetan civil servants he met at the reception centers along the way, in Nepal and Delhi, and finally, upon arrival in Dharamsala, who were tasked with handling the documents, finances, and needs of the recently arrived Tibetans. From Dharamsala's reception center, Tapsang was sent to Upper TCV, the first and the main headquarters of the TCV residential school system, where he would spend 2 years. It was his time at Patligul, another branch of TCV near Manali, where Tapsang went after Upper TCV, that made the most profound impact on him. At Patligul, he became a more serious student because of the small and intimate size of the school. Due to its remote location in the forested mountains, teachers and students lived in close proximity. As was the case with Taring Amala and her generation of educators and caretakers, teachers were not simply teachers. They also took on the role of caring adults, neighbors, and adoptive parents. It was normal, according to Tapsang, for teachers to invite students to their homes to share meals with their families. Tapsang quickly took a liking to 2 teachers who guided and inspired him to become a good student. The first was a science teacher by the name of Gentashi. Gentashi was an inspiring teacher, recalls Tapsang. He always made class material interesting. Gentashi had a daily habit of reading newspapers, which Tapsang emulated. Tapsang also credits Gentashi for instilling in him a love of reading English. The second teacher to make a profound impact on Tapsang was Gyengao Weber, a Tibetan language teacher. Creative fiction writing was popular among students when Tapsang was in school. Gyengao took advantage of this trend by having students write soms, short stories, they needed to compose in Tibetan as part of their coursework. This had an effect of inspiring a love of Tibetan literature and stories among students, as Tapsang has maintained a close relationship with Gyengao that has lasted well beyond school and into his adulthood. Tapsang also developed close relationship with his fellow students. Tapsang said he sometimes felt lonely at school, especially when his classmates born to families in exile brought stories of family fun back from the holiday breaks. When I asked how he coped with such loneliness, Tapsang emphasized his friendships. Some were friends from Lhasa whom he had met at the reception center in Dharamsala, while others were classmates he met at school. They shared money, clothes, food, and all other resources. While reflecting on these relationships, Tapsang said he realizes now that these friends were like family to him. Tapsang had one family in Tibet and this expanded network of family in exile. By mobilizing idioms of family, kinship, in this way, Tapsang reinforced the enduring quality and closeness of these relationships. This was not about replacing family with friends, but instead represented a way of adapting to the realities of being separated from family in the face of continuing colonialism. Tapsang credits these strong friendships with keeping him from facing emotional problems in exile. Even though he and his friends are now adults living in different parts of the world, they continue to be in touch with one another. Many continue to send him money and clothes from afar. Their connections as family, not just as school friends, are now normative in the global Tibetan diaspora. Tapsang's story demonstrates how strong bonds of affinity, solidarity, and care among and between students and teachers allowed novel forms of kinship to emerge within the schools. While many details of his story reflect the particular experiences of students belonging to the second generation, the kin-making relationships described by Tapsang were common across all generations of students who attended the Tibetan school system in exile. Alongside these bonds of kinship that took root in schools, the curriculum also forged solidarity and belonging by emphasizing a shared civilizational history, as well as the more recent history of China's occupation. These teachings helped form political subjectivities and a shared sense of national identity and responsibility among students, in tandem with stressing a common history as well as a shared struggle for freedom. Kinship reconfigured along national lines. Tibetans in exile across the diaspora and in Tibet created more than what Benedict Anderson would call imagined community. Instead, they became a family. In this way, Tibetan refugees maintained a government in exile not through territorial sovereignty, but through the formation of subjects who felt a sense of national kinship and belonging, and in turn recognized the exile government's structural, institutional, and symbolic existence and power. Next. Caring for one another, in other words, became a radical act of Tibetan nationalism and Buddhist altruism against Chinese colonial violence and dispossession for Tibetans in exile. This form of care, which I define as radical compassion, understood survival as relational and dependent on one another. It was through such radical acts of compassion with one another that Tibetan refugees were able to survive and reproduce 3 generations into a national community with an anti-colonial national cause against Chinese colonialism in exile. Such caring ethics of the Tibetan refugee community and hopeful prospects for Tibetan nationalism is what enticed Tibetans living under Chinese occupation in Tibet to make the escape journey to India. This is important. While Tibetans relied on legal and financial help from the Indian government and other international organizations to recreate Tibetan spaces such as the schools in exile, it was the caring labor and leadership that produced, it was Tibetan caring labor and leadership that produced these physical spaces of care and their practice of radical compassion that ensured their survival together as a people in exile. This showcases the important role Tibetans themselves played in the recreation and renewal of their own social, political, cultural, and spiritual worlds in exile. This emphasis is important and is something that the younger generation needs to realize. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dawa. And I think, just to kind of like highlight, and I want to thank you for sharing your current work and talking about Tibet through a different lens. So yes, I'll take some questions. Tihoyuna.
Samjage yine digorda.
Hello, just like I have one question. Question on improving Tibetan children life with the love and compassion. We know that ever since we lost our country, our elder generations did many contributions to improve our disparate children's lives and re-educating them. My question to you is, presently as a parent responsibility, number one, number two, the Tibetan government in exile responsibility, and number three is how we as a youngster or individuals that we can contribute, help to our children to re-educating them, to make sure that they will receive a good modern educations, so that they will contribute for the cause of Tibet in future. And what are the views on that?
Okay, so this presentation actually answers that question. So I'm going to pose this question back to you guys, okay? So just to be clear, His Holiness and Taring Amala, they're the first generations. What are they preoccupied doing? They're the ones who experienced invasion. They escaped into exile. And what was their first impulse? What were they doing in the story? Can somebody... So what did you guys observe from the story? What did you learn from the story? Supedara. Pomodun suge kuch this participate chirujadara pomodun shiras keshing da kablo dedi da.
dangi di pyoge la chwa jigra hajuna ngaya inji yago shiramera ine kirangi lecture mangul sungge de mangche ji da gerab ki kale khajus kya yume da konjo gi lodong dinjo gi story do re dra ani inji yago de me de ine da kala kanjam do ji go chunge do chisra ani thanda cho di odi ta thanda di khala gore lugyu she sha gyo dinjo nalon cho di koran jo gi lugyu da ani koran jo gi 아니 녜기 다칼라고리 만주기 베베토라 칼레 가감스 갸메 르동 가즈스 지에메 딘주토라 시에선도 섬부터 나왔던데시
Taring Amala and them were also concerned with the future, right? That's exactly what we're concerned about. What did they do to meet this anxiety about the future? What were they doing? Who did they invest in? Who did they build all of this world for?
The next generation.
Exactly. The next generation, right? What did they do? They took all of their vision for the future and hope, and they invested it into a generation of children who had also lost. Everyone had lost something. They had lost their country. They had lost their family. Some people had lost their children. Some people had lost their parents. What did they do? They decided to care for each other. We invested in each other. We became family to each other, right? These schools became a way to create these physical spaces. These places are created by people and by the investment of people. And what did that first generation went on to do? You guys also heard about the first generation of students. They grew up. What happened? Dorji was an example of that first generation of students. What did you guys think? What did they do? Exactly. Everything, first generation, when they became an adult, they actually manifested those. They were like, Taring Amala invested in me, I'm going to invest in you. So what do you think we need to do? We can learn from these experiences, right? They teach us that we need to invest in each other. We need to practice love and compassion with each other. And because love and compassion is what 3 generations survived on. And we were able to create a movement and build a whole community that continues to threaten China even today. You know, so we need to realize how powerful this is. China is a global power. We are a refugee community, yet it is so threatened by us and what we do in exile. We need to realize that it was 3 generations who invested in that for us to be capable to do that, right? So what else? What else did you guys learn?
Hi, I actually have one question. My question to you is like, do you think can compassion be a political act in Tibetan thought, or it's just simply spiritual?
Well, what do you guys think? Taring Amala answered. I talked about this in Taring Amala. Does somebody have a response? Caring and nurturing after children, right? So for example, Nga Dorji was a child that Ama Taring invested in, right? Both through Cham Dangingche and also actually guidance, right? So who does he become later? Education director of TCV, the first principal of the Dalai Lama Institute, right? And what happens? Investing in the next generation is a powerful political and an ethical act. Chamdang Yingje in this scenario is empowering because you are literally keeping children alive, these children who become a threat to China later. Gotsude. Do you understand? It's not just a spiritual act in this scenario. How is that? I mean, even like somebody knew though, what did you guys learn? So I'm trying to explain how one generation produced the second generation, right? And that second generation produced us. Those children became pamas, for example. You know, when I say to reproduce the biological world, I mean actually reproducing the next generation. Okay? Some activism, of course that's important. But raising a new generation is everyday work. It takes a lot of work. That's raising the next generation, right? We need to understand how these everyday labored work contributed to who we are today, right?
Okay, 아니 저 타마디로.
Hello, tanga di tiwa di dinra zo di dakhala ore thanda ngengi tamshi nanglo la mangche jita mirep gemba gi kale khams kya me khoran zo lodong khajus chi me ani khoran zo gi thuju di nanglo la love and compassion so semba ding ne yeche ani pu zo la sogyong khande chi me digi ani phaja digi ta thanda next generation zo dus yon de ora ani ngema gi midin zo imba na ani ji 조조 디다 dakhala ore nganjo gi phyogi nedang thap kyoshu gi thuju de la khe de du khorang gi emotional loga ji ora chowa loga ji ora di kembe lega chidang da samlo tang dang da lodong da duzu sangma loga ji yong ora ta ine thanda nganjo thanda gi generation ro chasha wa ina mi changwa benjo yago cha de orta nyema ji wa ina thanda benjo be mi se yago chage yago benjo shashana thirengi nganjo dende dinde gi jika khala ore 제고직 주에 라원에 조선 먹고 싫어라 딘데기 조선 탑저치 두어래 딘데기 리그지 빼두어라 인바네 단데기 제너레이션 데라 니만나신기 디지 칼라워래 셈잡 주어라 다직 소속이 초와 주어라 안간주 지조 데라 직 치우고도 삼맥이 초와 주어라 닝간주 디스 마 렉차루다 마 껴루루다 디 용단디 컨데스 용고레스라야 아니 디토라 양 계시 야 부스 야 고니 야 직배기 토라니 키랑 딘데토라 심지 치고디 안 단대기 제너레이션 딘도라 삼로 칸데시 당고래 내가 칸데시 치고래 딘데토라는 걸 삼주시나르나 수에
다 단다 디 theme 디 카레 단다 디 theme 디 honoring the past shaping the future 라 나가 나라 Kari noticed Chislana, so I've been asked to come talk at several future of Tibet kind of events, right? Ani nyegi kari noticed Chislana lochung anzu. Of course, we're obsessed with our own generation. We're obsessed with the present, right? Ani present situation ltani minde ta thanda di mendo laga gyorishang zuminde. Ngazi chizo na la chik samja chi shedlana duga matu ya ko emenda. Oh nga ti khos gossip ti khos se druminde. Mi ko la duga matu ya ga che ko menda. Personally, I always found that to be a bit discouraging, right? Then dine chiktanga kari thongslana like I said, this little world threatens Tibet, threatens the Chinese government, a global power. But I don't think that a lot of the younger generation is quite aware. Tangada diaspora, I see how much China mobilizes against the Tibetan government, for example. Right? It is an institution that threatens their sovereign claims in Tibet, because the Tibetan government represents the sovereign interests of the collective destiny of the Tibetan people. That's why this institution was created by His Holiness. Right? But I realized there was this lack of awareness of this. Right? That was partially the reason why I embarked on this project. I said the younger generation needs to understand who built their world, who created these movements. It was the first and the second generation, right? But it wasn't just to learn about it. It wasn't just about honoring the past, right? It was also about learning from the past. What I learned from Taring Amala is that yes, political advocacy is important, but every day caring after members of your community is also a radical political act. Because here's the thing, Chinese occupation every day diminishes the Tibetan population, right? They target Tibetan lives. So preserving Tibetan lives in exile is also radical. A Tibetan who's not only preserved, a life is not only preserved, but raised and educated to understand the Tibetan national history and lead a movement, that's much more powerful, right? So what I learned from them is every day, caring about everyday members of our community is itself a radical, compassionate, and political act of survival. And we need to learn from that. I think the current generation is too obsessed with the present without understanding the past and is not learning from the past and not appreciating the kind of labor that it took for the two generations to bring us here, okay? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. And that's important to not only understand, but to learn from. There's so much to learn from that generation.
And I'll just ask one question. That the talk now into the pugate so na kyang the dichidu gabla tang azu pene le thangbo phenge jola didanya gejus na phenge judu gabla this concept of like this a collective story or a collective narrative or a collective experience, right? However, in the last 10-30 years that collective experience is very different. But I do feel there is collective experience. How do we make that a collective experience for this generation?
So that's where the schools come into play. To me, what I realized is the schools became a place for the gathering of these different generations. Tanga ngegi examples jishana that TCV 보건소 graduate chisa niminde susu life adult life start chigor antene kaagaza khator dor. Like I experienced the making of Tibetan community in America, right? I shifted there in the 90s. And Pigela, New York, for example, community built, community built much in a movement that first we need a community, right? And what I noticed was CST batchmate, TCV batch, they started creating community with each other. And those groups of people created spaces of community so then we can advocate for Tibet together. Creating community is extremely important. Unity should not be just a symbol. It's powerful. It's how we have created a successful movement that other movements like to copy from and learn from. Tibetans are not aware that we are seen as an example around the world to follow. Di ngaran zu ge shiras go tsung min da lo chung adaze. Di go chue ke chen bu really. So schools became a space for this kind of radical act of belonging together, creating community together, building movements together. Ra. And it didn't matter where we went around the world. Pazu labda chikpa imba hagona saja sawa chile minde kunzu community chik build chir. Community chik build china, movement chik start chir. Gozi. So I think there's somebody very basic, right? Ting ngaranzu ge shiras appreciate chingminda. And I'm saying let's look at these things and how important these connections. Last all connections and relationships is how we build community. And that's exactly what I'm showing. That's what the first generation invested in. And that's what they manifested with the second generation, right? Now it's our turn. What are we going to do, right? And that's going to start with us making a decision about the present and how we want to engage with each other, okay? There's only a small number of us. And I will say, I tend to, academic spaces, not like you do, I tend to meet a lot of Tibetan students from Tibet who never get to come to India, but they study abroad, right? Konzo tsangma minde, zenjo la mikpe tasa saja zigi duda. Nganzo shung la na petsa chimpu zigi duda. Nganzo shung di koranzo shung zigi warda. Okay? It's very important to know how we become an example for what they aspire for inside. Nganzo pazu that becomes an example for how they want to enact relationships inside. Okay? Ultimately, our movement and our community needs people to build relationship with each other to create these massive movements. Okay? We have to understand it from the people to people and personal relations level. Okay? And also, like I said, activism is important, but building community is where it starts. Okay?
Let's thank you so much, Dawa. Any someone any tanda ganzu soja pasen che and DJ la any tanda the next session di go tsugu yoro.